This is the peony that I'm going to paint on silk today. And as you can see, I already have it drawn, and in order to make the drawing more visible through the silk, I trace it with a marker. Peonies have a rather complicated shape, but if you imagine that it's basically a sphere, only chunky, it becomes much easier to draw. I usually pin the drawing to the silk with pins to keep it from shifting. I have a small frame today and the silk is stretched. It's optional, but I do put some kind of book underneath so that the surface of the drawing is higher up for the better view. But if you are using transparent silk, you won't need this. On the left, I usually have the laptop with the reference on the screen, and on the right, I have the paints. First, I just wet the lightest parts of the petals with water. Then, very gradually, I begin to introduce the color and the shades I see in this peony. The brushes I'm using today are flat bristle brushes, but then I'll take a softer brush, a round one. As always, I have a palette handy. It's actually a usual plate. I dilute the paint heavily with water, so I achieve pale shades. Here is my reference. As you can see, a peony, although generally white, it has a lot of yellowish and pinkish tones. My challenge at this stage is not to over darken the petals, because I can always make them darker, but getting them back to a lighter tone is much harder. And that's the reason why I'm building up the color shaping so gradually and carefully. You may notice that my brush is very often semi-dry. This slows down the spreading of the paint and the blending of the color with the other. Now I'm starting to intensify the shadows. In each petal there are many shades, there are warm and cold tones, close, similar and contrasting colors, and all this I try to convey. For the resist. A lot of people say gutta, but I like the word resist. I've been asked many times how I prepare it, and I hope to make a video about it pretty soon, and also how to tint the resist. In the illuminated part of the peony, I use a minimum of color. That is, I reduce its value to almost zero. There you can say it's mostly water. I try not to paint each petal separately, but look at the flower as the general mass or body, which, as I noticed before, resembles a ball. By the way, I have a video on my channel where I showed how to paint volume on the example of geometric shapes. After I have defined the general outlines of the volume, found the light and dark areas, I begin to add detail to the petals. You may have noticed that even though I use a lot of water, my resist doesn't allow the dyes to flow beyond the contour line. And in fact, even though it's time consuming to make and frankly smells like petrol, I still prefer to use it in my work. The reasons are few. First, it's elastic, doesn't become stiff on silk after drying. Second, it repels moisture well, so the colors don't bleed through it. Third, I can tint it any color I want. So there will be a video soon on how to make the resist by yourself. True, there are all sorts of nuances, but I'll tell you about them too. Returning to the peony. Now I want to outline the background, so it will be clear to me how to further paint the peony. To emphasize the lighted part of the flower, I make the background darker on the border. Sometimes I add the background color to the flower to make the image more integral, so that it doesn't feel like the peony is cut out. On the shadow side of the peony, I make the background lighter, softer, but this is for now. I think that later I will make the whole background darker. Now it's obvious to me that I need to deepen the shadows to make them more manifested. The detailing I usually do with a semi-dry brush. This is behind the scenes, but I keep a paper towel handy to dry the brush. Here's the petal closest to us, and to bring it forward, I highlight it with a darker color and outline the stem and leaves. The drop shadow is on this petal, and I paint it with an almost dry brush, but the petal itself is still wet. I'll finish the shadow later. Since the overall picture doesn't seem expressive enough and I want to make it quite contrasty, I go back to the background again. I'm no longer guided by my reference, but by my own feelings. After drawing the background, I decided to specify the leaves and the stem. I outlined them with the resist. It will then need to dry. In the meantime, I will add saturation to the shadows. And now it's the right moment to paint the drop shadow on this petal. This is once again me painting the background to get the right saturation. About my dyes. Specifically, these dyes are industrial dyes for silk and wool. They exist in powder form. They were bought back in the last century at the textile factory. In general, dyes are divided into several classes. I'm not a chemist, I cannot say more precisely, but my dyes don't give any halos, or in other words, dark borders. But since it's unlikely that most of my viewers have access to such dyes, I'll be switching to more affordable dyes and paints in my videos to make it easier for you. Here's one of my tricks that I've told you about before in this video right here. In places where the resist looks light to me, I overlap it with a semi-dry permanent marker. Not too much, just a little bit. And finally, this is the result that I'm satisfied with.